The woman known to history as Isabel I, Queen of Castile, was born on the 22nd of April 1451 at the royal palace in the town of Madrigal de las Altas Torres, in the Castilian province of Avila. Her father was Juan II, King of Castile and Leon, and her mother was Isabella of Portugal, and Isabel was their first child together. At her baptism at the Church of San Nicolas, when she was just a few days old, she was proclaimed the Infanta Isabel, although she would be known in English as Isabella. This title of Infanta was a significant one for a Spanish princess. Usually, a royal daughter was known as an Infanta, a gendered term which acknowledged that while she was a princess, she was not a potential heir to the crown. The choice to give Isabel the title of Infanta likely lay with the dynastic situation in Castile. At the time of Isabel's birth, Juan II already had a son and heir, the 26-year-old Enrique, the only surviving child of Juan II's first wife, Maria of Aragon. By the time of his sister's birth, Enrique had been married for 11 years to Blanche II of Navarre, but they had no children. Isabel's investiture with the title of Infanta, which could refer to either a male or female child, signaled that she was not just a royal princess, but a potential heir to the throne of Castile. In 1453, when Isabel was 2 years old, her mother gave birth to a second child, a son named Alfonso, who was promptly proclaimed second in line to the Castilian throne ahead of his older sister. A year after Alfonso's birth, Juan II died, leaving his elder son to reign as Enrique IV, King of Castile. After her husband's death, the Dowager Queen Isabel took her 2 children to live at the royal residence in Arevalo, where her late husband had granted her substantial lands and rents. Her stepson, the new King of Castile, soon paid them a visit to instruct the Dowager Queen in the new status quo. Isabel would be permitted to keep custody of her children as long as she maintained her widowhood and virtue. Should she marry again, he informed her, Isabel and Alfonso would be removed from her care and given into the king's charge. Isabel's early childhood in Arevalo has traditionally been described as one of straitened financial circumstances. Historical accounts up until the early 20th century claimed that King Enrique did not provide for his stepmother and younger siblings in accordance with the dictates of his father's will. More recent historians have theorized that reports of relative poverty in Isabel's childhood were significantly exaggerated by contemporary chroniclers. This does not necessarily mean that the reports of Enrique withholding funds from the inheritance of his stepmother and her children were false. Their household may not have been accorded the level of opulence one would expect for a royal family, but historians today doubt that they were kept in any real state of want as far as food, clothing, books, or other household necessities were concerned. Their freedom of movement was nonetheless significantly restricted, and Enrique would remain continually alert to any excuse he might seize upon to remove Isabel and Alfonso from their mother's care. Young Isabel's childhood in Arevalo likely contributed much to the formation of her character and personality. One chronicler noted that her mother, the Dowager Queen, was often sad and anxious, frequently given to shutting herself away in the darkness of her bedchamber. These ascriptions suggest that Isabel of Portugal suffered from depression. When the family moved to Arevalo after the death of Juan II, the Dowager Queen's mother came to live with them. Isabel's grandmother, Isabel of Barcelos, was a strong, opinionated, and intelligent role model for her grandchildren. She promptly took charge of her daughter's household and helped organize her grandchildren's early education. As the daughter of the Duke of Braganza, an illegitimate son of King João I of Portugal, she almost certainly knew a thing or two about clearing pathways to power, especially for unlikely candidates. In fact, chroniclers record that Juan II had invited his mother-in-law to sit in on royal council meetings. While it is unclear whether she was permitted to contribute openly, Juan almost certainly invited her to attend so that he could ask her opinion on political matters, even if only in private. Young Isabel seems to have benefited a great deal from her grandmother's strong presence. She loved and revered her mother, but given the Dowager Queen's mental health challenges and tendency to isolate herself from her household, Isabel may have more often taken comfort in her grandmother, who remained at the side of her daughter and grandchildren until her death in 1465. In her adult years as Queen of Castile, Isabel continued to seek, appreciate and value the company, counsel and wisdom of older women. Isabel's early education, and her brother Alfonso's as well, was organized by their mother and grandmother. The Dowager Queen's household stewards, the politician Gonzalo Chacon, and his wife Clara Alvarez, who was Isabel's aya or nurse governess, played significant roles educating and raising her as well. Chacon and Clara remained close, serving members of Isabel's household all her life, and were among the few people in the world whom she trusted implicitly. During their childhood in Arevalo, Isabel and her brother were taught to read and write and were given religious instruction. Both would later also study history and arithmetic with tutors at the court of their brother Enrique IV in Segovia, to which both Isabel and Alfonso were moved when they were just 10 and 8 years old, respectively. For most of her young life, Isabel lived in a region of the Iberian Peninsula known as the Meseta, a predominantly agricultural region on a high plateau bordered by mountains to the east and south, comprising many villages and market towns. Picturesque, bucolic and quiet, Isabel grew up surrounded by fertile wheat fields and vineyards. To the north lay the spring and summer pastures where sheep, goats and cattle grazed, and where the sunrises and sunsets were even more spectacular when the red gold dust blew on the wind. Unfortunately, she would come to learn her beautiful country and its ordinary people were at the mercy of lawlessness and factional fighting between nobles as a result of weak central governance. Enrique IV was a deeply unpopular king amongst the grandes, the Castilian nobility. 15th-century Castilian nobles and clergy were divided on many issues, but virtually all were united in the belief that it was the sacred duty of the monarch to both rule justly and, more importantly, to pursue a crusade against the Muslims in Spain to restore Catholicism as the region's sole religion. Enrique IV seemed to disappoint the grandes on every front. Rather than taking a strong, active approach to local law enforcement and the preservation of regional peace, Enrique simply delegated local authority along with lands, rents and incomes to the nobles most opposed to him in a bid to buy their loyalty or appease their dissatisfaction with his regime. He did little to curb the infighting between nobles who continued to compete over territory, while ordinary working people were exploited by corrupt officials and elites. Contemporary writers reported frequent incidences of robbery and sexual assault committed with impunity against the citizenry due to the lack of organized local law enforcement. Further, Enrique seemed uninterested in pursuing an earnest Catholic crusade against Muslim-ruled Spain, making him even more unpopular. He did launch a campaign against the Emirate of Granada between 1455 and 1458, but was heavily criticized for what the nobles viewed as his ineffectiveness. Enrique's campaign, encompassed a few skirmishes with Granadan forces, but assiduously avoided large battles or offensives. He was most broadly condemned for accepting generous tributary terms from Granada for the cessation of hostilities. But even beyond these perceived failings, Enrique was even more despised for his unconventional personal life. His marriage to Blanche II of Navarre was annulled in 1453. Both Enrique and Blanche submitted that their marriage had never been consummated, which it may well not have been, seeing as it produced no children in 13 years. Less than a year after the death of his father, Enrique married Princess Juana of Portugal. 6 years later, in 1462, Juana gave birth to a daughter, also named Juana, whom Enrique promptly proclaimed heir to the throne of Castile. When it came time for his queen's confinement in the late fall and winter of 1461, Enrique commanded that Isabel and Alfonso be brought to live at his court in Segovia to complete their educations, he said. Presumably, now that he was about to have an heir of his own, he wanted the other two infantas under his control as well. Alfonso was placed with a tutor and governor, and Isabel was initially placed in Queen Juana's household, where she attended the queen during her confinement and labor, and even became godmother to her niece, Princess Juana, at her baptism. Just 2 years later, the nobles turned on Enrique once again. A rumor had begun to spread amongst the grandees that Princess Juana had not been fathered by Enrique, but by his favorite and advisor, Beltran de la Cueva, Duke of Albuquerque. A powerful cadre of nobles now demanded that Enrique send away his wife, repudiate 2-year-old Princess Juana, who they scathingly nicknamed La Beltraneque, and declare his younger brother Alfonso heir to the throne, which, surprisingly, Enrique did in 1464. The most insulting of the king's critics referred to him as the impotent, the truth of which will likely never be known. While his 13-year marriage to Blanche of Navarre produced no children and his second marriage did not produce a child for 6 years, it is still possible that Juana was Enrique's daughter. Historians are more inclined to believe that Enrique IV was homosexual rather than impotent, as he showed much less interest in women throughout his life, even in his wives, than he did in the company of male favorites at court. It took Enrique less than a year to repudiate Alfonso as the future king and reinstate Juana as the Castilian heir. It did not help the king's case that his wife, whom he had sent away, gave birth to 2 illegitimate children with her lover Pedro de Castilla between 1465 and 1468. Enrique's reinstatement of Juana sparked a 3-year-long civil war. Numerous Castilian nobles and the towns they controlled declared for Alfonso. They enacted themselves, deposing King Enrique IV in the form of an effigy in a public spectacle which became known as the Farce of Avila, and proclaimed the 11-year-old King of Castile. Throughout all of this upheaval, the teenaged Isabel had quietly observed and learned a great deal from the political situation in her closely guarded royal residence in Segovia. Following Queen Juana's departure, Isabel was granted her own household and income. She lived a fairly sheltered life restricted to the palace with several ladies-in-waiting as companions, but was kept well informed of Castile's political situation by powerful noble relatives and supporters of her brother's claim. Between the ages of 13 and 17, Isabel spent most of her time at her studies. In addition to her lessons in history, mathematics, grammar, and religion, Isabel also received lessons in music, dance, and embroidery. After attending morning mass, she and her ladies pursued these accomplishments daily. Another of Isabel's favored diversions was playing chess, a game which she was said to have played exceptionally well. Her love of the game and the evolution of the game of chess itself during her lifetime deserves some discussion. Isabel's interest in chess and her reported mastery of the game has obvious implications for the impressive sense of political and military strategy for which she later became renowned. But more interesting still is that prior to the introduction of chess in Spain by Muslim conquerors in the 8th century, all chess pieces represented male figures, and the piece which flanked the king was usually a general or vizier. When the first piece representing a queen was added some years later, it could only move a single diagonal space at a time. It was during the reign of Isabel, one of the first true queens regnant to come to power in post-Roman medieval Europe, that the game evolved into the one we know and play today, in which the queen is the most powerful piece on the board. When this version was introduced in late 15th century Spain, it became known as Queen's Chess. In addition to her studies, Isabel spent a significant portion of her teenage years confronting and avoiding multiple marriage propositions which her brother Enrique attempted to impose upon her. The king negotiated betrothals for her several times. The first, when she was just 6 years old. 2 Aragonese princes, a French prince, a Castilian nobleman, as well as the King of Portugal, all attempted to negotiate an engagement to Isabel. She was even considered as a bride for Edward IV of England or his brother Richard III. Ultimately, Isabel managed to avoid being married off by her older brother, whose sole interest in these affairs seemed to be making sure that his sister married someone who would cut her off from the power structure in Castile, removing her from the succession. 2 of Isabel's would-be suitors, Charles of Viana and Don Pedro Girón Pacheco, died before the marriages could take place. Charles was executed for treason by his own father Juan II of Navarre for leading a rebellion in Catalonia and attempting to marry Isabel, when Charles's own younger brother, Fernando of Aragon, had already been promised to her 3 years before. Isabel was just 15 years old and vulnerable when Enrique arranged her marriage to Don Pedro Girón Pacheco in exchange for an unprecedented sum of money, more than enough to finance the civil war, in which Enrique now found himself embroiled against his younger brother Alfonso. Upon receiving word that her betrothal had been finalized, and Don Pedro was en route to claim his bride, Isabel reportedly abstained from sleep and food for 2 days, praying ceaselessly that something would intervene to prevent the marriage. She received word on the morning her fiancé was supposed to arrive that he had suddenly fallen sick with bubonic plague during his journey and had died within hours. Isabel well and truly believed that God had interceded for her, and it gave her courage to resist any subsequent efforts on Enrique's part to force her into a marriage of his choosing. The civil war to establish Alfonso as the heir of Castile ended with the 14-year-old boy's unfortunate death. But it appeared that Alfonso had died of plague. The nobles supporting him suspected he had been poisoned. Rather than reconcile with the king, the rebellious nobles now transferred their loyalties to the 16-year-old Isabel, urging her to declare herself Queen of Castile. Young as she was, Isabel proved to be far more prudent and strategic than some of the nobles supporting her. Rather than become the new head of Alfonso's rebellion, she instead chose to negotiate and reconcile with Enrique. While she assured him that she revered him both as her king and her older brother, she also boldly reproached him for his treatment of her throughout her life. She accused him of withholding her inheritance left to her by their father. She reproached him for his attempts to force her to marry against her will and emphatically refused the marriage to the King of Portugal that Enrique was even then trying to negotiate for her. Bolder still, Isabel demanded that Enrique recognize her as his heir, since, she reminded him, he had already admitted publicly in 1464 that his wife had been unfaithful and that La Belle Trineka was illegitimate. Recognizing that the tide had turned against him, perhaps permanently, Enrique accepted Isabel's terms. Peace was restored, and Enrique's rule, if not his daughter, was accepted as legitimate. Isabel was named the official heir to the Castilian throne, and Enrique promised he would never again attempt to arrange her marriage without her consent. In return, Isabel promised not to marry without the approval and consent of both Enrique and a plurality of the nobles. By both preserving her existing allies and cleverly outmaneuvering her brother, Isabel had given herself time to breathe and strategize for the future. By 1468, it was clear to her that only one marriage prospect would do: Fernando of Aragon. It must be him and no other, she wrote to one of her advisors. Isabel and Fernando had first been betrothed to one another years before when they were 6 and 7 years old respectively. The betrothal had sunk into limbo, along with the potential alliance between Enrique IV and Fernando's father Juan II of Navarre. But Isabel was eager to revive it. Juan II had succeeded to his brother Alfonso V's territories of Aragon and Sicily, which his son Fernando would also inherit, and was no less eager for Fernando to add Castile to his patrimony by marrying her. Isabel, however, had no intention of simply surrendering her power to her husband, certainly not in the manner that Fernando, or his father, likely envisioned. In Fernando, Isabel saw a promising young man who could help her realize all of her ambitions. At 18 years old, he was already a proven soldier in battle and an impressive military commander. He was enormously popular with the Castilian people for his handsomeness, intelligence, and charisma. His father, uncles, and grandfather had Castilian royal blood, guaranteeing that he would be accepted by the Castilian nobility and people alike. What's more, he could help organize and lead her armies, and if his reputation with women was to be believed, he could give her many children. Isabel understood that if she was to reign as queen with any security, she absolutely had to marry. Some European countries like France and Aragon had long established Salic laws which expressly prohibited women from inheriting political power in their own right. Castile had no such laws officially, but still, no Castilian royal lady had ruled as queen in centuries. In the millennium following the fall of Rome, only 2 women on the entire European continent had ever reigned as true queen regnant: Margaret I of Denmark and Mary, Queen of Hungary and Croatia. Both of these women ruled during the late 14th century, 50 or 60 years before Isabel's birth. While Isabel would not truly be the first, she was certainly among the first women in many centuries to exercise such power in Europe. Students of European history might be surprised to find feminist critiques in the works of medieval and early modern European writers, but, in fact, the 14th, 15th and 16th centuries saw several writers of philosophies publish treatises advocating for female political power as well as the promotion of women's education. Christine de Pizan, poet, mystic, and one of Europe's first professional female writers, completed her Book of the City of Ladies around 1405, a text which could be found in the libraries of several powerful European royal and noble women by the 1500s. While he is better known for his research and writing on the occult, the German scientist and philosopher Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa wrote a similar text proclaiming women's intellectual equality with men and their fitness for education and leadership, entitled On the Nobility and Preeminence of the Female Sex. Agrippa dedicated this work to Margaret of Austria, a living and very fitting example of Agrippa's argument. Isabella of Castile was born into a world that was only just beginning to consider the extension of legitimacy to women's power and leadership. Her reign was the beginning of a notable trend towards female rulers in late medieval and early modern Europe. Reigning as queen regnant was a tricky business nonetheless. A medieval queen had to secure the throne with children to succeed her, and the only way to do that was to marry. On the other hand, marriage vows bound women to obey and defer to their husbands in all things, adding complications to the concept of a monarch's right to rule independently. While Isabel viewed marriage as a necessity for her purposes, she and her advisors ensured that she would retain her superior authority as Queen of Castile through the imposition of a carefully crafted marriage contract. While Isabel always took care to present their union as a scrupulously equal partnership, the marriage contract was designed to preserve Isabel's ultimate authority as Queen of Castile. The terms of the contract required Fernando to live full-time in Castile and never attempt to compel either Isabel or their children to leave. He was to respect Castile's customs and nobles, make no grants of land or estate or issue any order or proclamation without Isabel's consent, nor enlist Castilian troops to fight for his territories of Aragon or Sicily. Both were designated as regents for their children in all of their territories in the event of the death of the other. Finally, the contract stipulated that Isabel and Fernando were honor-bound to lead a crusade against Muslim Granada. Fernando and his father accepted the terms, seemingly convinced that once they were married, Isabel would defer to Fernando as they felt a wife should. In her conduct as both queen and wife, Isabel skillfully managed to both conform to and frustrate her husband's expectations. Despite this balancing act, Isabel and Fernando seem to have had a loving and fairly happy marriage, as their surviving letters to one another testify. The two were married on the 19th of October 1469. Making the excuse that she was going to visit her mother, Isabel departed her brother's palace and traveled instead to Valladolid, where Fernando met her, having crossed the border into Castile disguised as a servant. They had little time to get to know each other on the eve of their wedding, but chroniclers report that they were both immediately impressed by and attracted to each other. Fernando was friendly, confident, outgoing, and gallant, a passionate personality whose cheerful moods could be as intense as his quick temper. Historians speculate that his surviving portraits likely do not do him justice, because chroniclers described him as tall, strong, and handsome, with dark brown hair and warm brown eyes. In contrast to Fernando, Isabel was short and stocky, with auburn or reddish gold hair and blue-green eyes. Where Fernando was quick to smile, Isabel was rather serious. Reserved and earnest, she considered her words and actions carefully, and did not easily extend her trust, but gave it fully when she did. Despite being named Enrique's official heir, Isabel's path to the throne still stretched dauntingly long before her. She and Fernando promptly wrote to King Enrique to inform him of their marriage. Anticipating his anger, Isabel begged his indulgence in a sisterly tone, implying that as his sister and heir, it was only just that he forgive her. She had not explicitly sought his permission as she had promised, but, she pointed out, a marriage had the approval of a plurality of Castile's nobles. Isabel and Fernando made sure that their letters not only reached the king, but were circulated throughout Castile as well wherever possible. It took Enrique more than a month to respond. He condemned his sister as a disobedient fallen woman and as a concubine. The marriage, he declared, could not be illegal, since the two were second cousins and too closely related to be married without a dispensation from the Pope. Enrique formally disinherited Isabel, reinstated his daughter Juana, and launched yet another civil war. Isabel and Ferdinand's first few years of marriage were stressful and unpredictable. Some nobles and towns that had previously declared for Isabel changed allegiances once Enrique disinherited her. In addition, Enrique confiscated and re-gifted his sister's lands and estates to others. As a result, Isabel and her young family moved around quite a bit, sheltering at the homes of relatives or in the few towns that still supported them. In October 1470, just 1 year after her marriage, Isabel gave birth to her first child, a daughter also named Isabel. The next 3 years saw her settle into a fairly active motherhood for such a busy woman. Isabel was continually engaged in a public relations campaign to woo Castilian support away from her brother. Enrique seemed to help rather than hinder this effort with his disorganized governing style, which was reactive rather than proactive. He often bought the loyalty of oppositional and recalcitrant nobles, which was neither a sound financial strategy nor an effective route to gaining their respect. Isabel's campaign of letter-writing and politicking had borne fruit by 1473, by which time a majority of Castilians once again supported her as Enrique's heir, and he was forced to reconcile with her. Cardinal Rodrigo de Borgia, later Pope Alexander VI, was instrumental in the reconciliation, offering what was most likely a forged papal dispensation for Isabel and Fernando's marriage. This document was purportedly signed by Pope Pius II, an impossibility since he had died 9 years before. During this period, Isabel also made efforts to establish her own authority from within her marriage. When it seemed that either her husband or her father-in-law tried to encroach upon her privileges or prerogatives as the true heir and eventual Queen of Castile in her own right, she acted decisively and firmly. When the town of Aranda, in remembrance of their historic Aragonese loyalties, hailed Fernando as their prince and declared their loyalty to both Fernando and Isabel, she made sure that she sent an emissary to accept their pledge in her name alone. When her father-in-law, Juan II, attempted to bar her emissary from establishing governance on Isabel's behalf in her new lands in Sicily, which were part of her marriage settlement, she wrote to him asking him respectfully not to interfere, since, she wrote, he could trust that she would always do what was right and just. On the 12th of December 1474, Isabel received the news of her brother's death. Enrique did not leave a will, nor any officially documented record of his wishes for the succession. Some accounts claim that he verbally confirmed Princess Juana as his true heir on his deathbed. Further struggle over the throne appeared to be inevitable. With the support of her council in Segovia, Isabel acted quickly. The very next morning, after receiving the news of Enrique's death, Isabel attended Mass in Segovia's church of San Miguel. She entered the church dressed in a plain white gown to symbolize her mourning for her brother. When Mass ended, she emerged from the church, dressed in an extravagant gown of rich red and bedecked in jewels. She stepped out onto a platform which had been hastily built the night before at the entrance to the church, and was proclaimed Queen of Castile. Crowds called out to her as she processed through the streets on horseback, followed by several nobles carrying her train, and preceded by a single nobleman holding a sword with the tip pointing skyward in a symbol of the Queen's authority. Fernando expressed shock and some disapproval when he was told of this. At the time, he was not even in Segovia, but in the Aragonese capital of Zaragoza. Though he had been married to her for 5 years already, and presumably should have been aware of his wife's ambitions and strong, resolute character, he seemed nonetheless surprised that she would take to herself the traditional symbol of warrior kings. Her assumption of the role of warrior queen, however, was one of the things that earned her the love of her people and her troops most especially. Immediately after ascending to the throne, Isabel began to take steps to make sure she could keep it. She had her daughter Isabel invested as Princess of Asturias, the official title held by the Castilian heir, and began to prepare for war. The supporters of Princess Juana, including her betrothed King Alfonso V of Portugal, were mobilizing to invade Castile and place Juana on the throne instead. Undoubtedly, the Castilian nobles and the Portuguese king were keen to see a vulnerable 12-year-old girl who would be easily controlled wearing the crown, rather than the strong 23-year-old Isabel and her equally self-possessed husband and co-ruler. The Portuguese invaded in 1475, and the resulting land war in Castile lasted a year, culminating with the Battle of Toro, which actually ended in a draw, at which Isabel and Fernando were able to frame as a victory due to the need for their enemy to retreat. Isabel and Fernando's messaging on the outcome of the conflict contributed to a collapse in morale among Juana's supporters, leaving Isabel and Fernando in possession of Castile. The resulting sea battles dragged on for a further 3 years, with the momentum by the end shifting decidedly in favor of the Portuguese. With their country secure once more, Isabel and Fernando now turned more attention to domestic concerns. They had learned to work in concert throughout the stresses and uncertainties of the previous few years, and had grown in respect and love for one another. Isabel had thawed towards the notion of Fernando as an equal co-ruler, and had given him full command of all military forces and strategy. She allowed his name to come first on all documents and deferred to him publicly, but always ensured her own preeminence as the hereditary monarch of Castile. Together, they embarked on a series of reforms and campaigns over the next 2 decades, which were deeply emblematic of their vision for a united Spain, one steeped in the apocalyptic Christian beliefs of the day. Centuries-old legends and prophecies predicted that a king of Spain would emulate King David, King Solomon, and Alexander the Great, but would exceed them all. He would conquer barbarians, subjugate Africa, destroy Egypt, and by regaining Jerusalem, usher in a final and triumphal golden age before the coming of Armageddon. While this vision might sound rather vengeful and violent to many modern Christians, 15th century Spain had limited scriptural texts in circulation. It was extremely rare in 15th century Europe for anyone to possess a complete copy of the New Testament. In fact, the most common scriptural texts on the Iberian Peninsula during this time were the Book of Revelation and the Hebrew Bible texts of Kings, Daniel, and Ezekiel. These are all apocalyptic texts, and the virtues of justice and vengeance far more emphasized than those of mercy and love. Every monarch in Europe to launch a crusade during the medieval and early modern period vied with one another to be viewed as the potentially messianic emperor of Europe, whose coming had been prophesied. Virtually all of the reforms that Isabel and Fernando implemented through their reign can be viewed as efforts in pursuit of this millenarian goal. Beginning in 1476, Isabel and Ferdinand launched legal reforms with the establishment of the Hermandades, or police force. Provincial militias formerly controlled by individual nobles now came under direct royal control, with the power to arrest, punish, and keep the peace. Crime rates plummeted. They also pursued financial reforms, shutting down the numerous mints which Enrique IV had granted as favors, as well as illegal mints producing counterfeit currency. They traveled to southern Spain, to Extremadura and Andalusia, to wrench trade, customs, taxation and law enforcement back into royal control, and subdued the region's powerful nobles, using their greed and feuds to play them off one another and thus bring them to heel. Having made major inroads towards domestic peace, towards centralization and consolidation of Spain's resources, Isabel and Fernando turned their attention to the first stage of their millenarian vision, the Inquisition. In many ways, the first stages of the Inquisition were a grassroots phenomenon. Jews in Spain had always suffered discrimination and oppression. They were heavily taxed and legally regulated in ways that Christian citizens were not, and anti-Semitism was extremely common among the Christian populace. Local officials and clergy increasingly petitioned and complained of what they called Judaizers, those who clung to their Jewish customs and encouraged others to do so while professing their Christian conversion. The Inquisition began as a commission to investigate and instruct conversos, or Jews who had converted to Christianity, in proper religious observance. This sparked outrage, and many Jews and conversos fled to noble enclaves for protection. By 1478, Isabel and Fernando had established the beginning of the infamous system of inquisitors, secret informants, torture and execution by burning at the stake. The choices for Jews were either to leave Spain, convert, and be reconciled to Christianity, or face execution. A key part of the millenarian vision for the Christian apocalypse was the destruction of the Jews. One of the Queen's chroniclers, Fernando del Pulgar, estimated that by the end of the 1480s, approximately 2,000 conversos had been condemned to death, and a further 15,000 reconciled, a process which involved a public penitent walk and self-flagellation before an often verbally and physically abusive crowd of citizens. By the early 16th century, nearly 40,000 Jews who refused conversion had been driven out of Spain. This constituted a painful break with history. There had been Spanish Jews for centuries. They, along with the Muslim population, had contributed enormously to scholarship, intellectualism, medicine, trade, law, art, and architecture. Most of the officials at Isabel and Fernando's court were educated conversos. Isabel's own father's confessor was a converso. Both Fernando and Isabel themselves had Jewish ancestry. Isabel admitted that her actions had devastated the Castilian economy. As Jewish families fled Spain with their property and wealth, the annual revenues of Seville alone declined by a third. The wealth confiscated throughout the years of the Inquisition, however, brought the crown revenues in excess of 50 million maravedis. In June of 1478, Isabel gave birth to her second child, a son named Juan, who was proclaimed Prince of Asturias. The birth of a male heir bolstered Isabel's rule, and within a year, she and Fernando had negotiated an end to the war with Portugal. All of the reforms they had initiated during the previous few years now seemed to have been crowned by God's favor with the birth of a son and heir, signifying to them that even greater victories were surely on the horizon. Just 1 year later, in November of 1479, Isabel gave birth to a second daughter, Juana. By 1482, Isabel and Fernando were ready to launch the war against Muslim-held Spain, which represented the next stage in prophecy fulfillment, the eradication of Muslim rule in Europe. At the time, the Ottoman Turks had already made major inroads into the Baltic region of Europe, lending a sense of urgency to Christian crusaders. By 1483, papal bulls of crusade were being printed and distributed across Spain. Those that joined the Holy War or pledged money to it would be awarded indulgences or forgiveness of their sins without having to make penance. By 1485, Isabel had ordered conscription of all nobles, clergy, and local officials, including converted Jews and Muslims. Anyone who served would receive a salary and a certificate of service. If they refused, their positions and privileges would be revoked. The conquest of the Emirate of Granada took 10 years and obscene amounts of money, resources, and blood to achieve. Both Fernando and Isabel solidified their reputations as the warrior king and queen between 1482 and 1492. Year after year, town after town fell to the Castilian forces. Ronda, Barca, Malaga, and finally, Granada itself. Artillery in the form of cannons, known as Lombards or wall breakers, were instrumental in these battles. Isabel was frequently present on the battlefield, resplendent in full plate armor on horseback with a drawn sword. While it was Fernando who led the soldiers into battle, Isabel was a nearly talismanic presence to her troops, who sometimes referred to her as King Isabel. Fernando was general and chief strategist, while she managed logistics and resources. She directed the requisition and distribution of food, weapons, and other siege resources for the tens of thousands of men serving in her armies, and organized remarkably efficient and mobile field hospitals to care for wounded soldiers. During the war to conquer Granada, Isabel gave birth to 2 more daughters, Maria in June of 1482 and Catalina in December of 1485. Despite the danger of an active war front, Isabel often kept her children with her while on campaign. Her eldest daughter, Isabel, now in her mid-teens, was her constant companion, and even her younger children remained with her, camping in tents with their mother, mere miles from the battlefield. 1492 was a watershed year in Isabel's reign as well as in Spanish history. On January 2nd, Granada surrendered. The peace treaty drafted some months later permitted Muslims and Jews who had not resisted conquest to continue living in peace. This promise did not last long, and within less than a decade, Jews and Muslims who refused conversion were expelled from Spain in their tens of thousands. 1492 was also the year that Isabel and Fernando launched the Colombian explorations. The Treaty of Alcazuvas, which had ended the war with Portugal during the 1470s, had effectively cut Castile out of the gold and slave trade with North and West Africa. They had, however, retained the Canary Islands, and Isabel intended to use them as a base to sail west in search of new routes to the Indies or to entirely new lands. Most famously, it was during the reigns of Isabella of Castile and Fernando of Aragon that one of history's most celebrated voyages took place, namely, the 4 expeditions of Christopher Columbus, a Genoese navigator, who the 2 monarchs bankrolled to undertake 4 separate crossings of the Atlantic to what we now know as the Caribbean, from 1492 to 1499. Although these expeditions are somewhat erroneously thought of as the first crossings to the New World, the first known landings having been undertaken by Viking explorers hundreds of years earlier, Columbus's missions were perhaps more important, as they paved the way for many more missions to the Americas, which would, eventually, result in the ultimate colonization of the immense continent, as well as the founding of the equally huge Spanish Empire, resulting in Spain becoming the most powerful country on Earth for some 200 years before it was eclipsed by the British Empire. Although Isabel and Fernando could not have known the repercussions of their decision to send ships to the west, the act of doing so makes them amongst the most important rulers in the history of Iberia, if not Western Europe as a whole, as the exploration and eventual conquest of the New World are amongst the most significant events in human history, giving rise to countries such as Mexico, Brazil, and the world's most powerful nation, the United States. It was Isabel and Fernando who set these events in motion, which is a fact that should not be forgotten. By the 1490s, Isabel seemed to have set the seal on her epitaph. She had achieved all she had set out to do. Every policy decision she had made had dovetailed with her belief in her sacred duty as Queen of Castile. The success of overseas exploration had made Spain the richest country in Europe. She had arranged prestigious marriages for her children. Isabel and Maria married into the Portuguese royal family. Juan married Margaret of Austria, daughter of the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian. Juana was wed to Philip of Burgundy, and Catalina, who would become known as Catherine of Aragon, was married to Arthur Tudor, Prince of Wales, and following his death, to his younger brother Henry VIII. While it seemed that fate had set its seal on all her good work and rewarded her, the 1490s and the turn of the 16th century would be years of deep personal loss and reflection for Isabel. Her mother, her only son, and her eldest daughter all died within 3 years of one another. The Dowager Queen in 1496, Prince Juan, whose health had always been precarious, in 1497, and her daughter Isabel, who died in childbirth in 1498. While she had always been an ardent Christian, she became even more contemplative and devout following these personal tragedies. While she was still the queen and could appear fierce and magnificent in her extravagant clothes and fabulous jewels, she was, despite her grand status and enormous wealth, most comfortable in a Franciscan habit, which she often wore privately. In accordance with her wishes, Isabel was bedded in this traditional habit of Franciscan monks, which was believed would help the wearer enter heaven more easily. Isabel began to sicken in 1502. The extremities of her body swelled and doctors identified her illness as dropsy, or what is known today as congestive heart failure. She died on the 26th of November at the Royal Palace at Medina del Campo, at the age of 53, having ruled for 30 years. She was succeeded by her daughter Juana, whose son, Charles, would not only become King of Spain, but also the Holy Roman Emperor. Fernando served as regent for Juana, known as Juana the Mad, although this attribution probably has more to do with her personality than with any actual mental health issues. Fernando died in 1516 and was buried next to his wife and queen. Long revered by the Spanish and other European Christians as an unofficial saint and servant of God, Catholic clergy during the 1950s began to advocate and campaign for Isabel's canonization within the Church. Such a process takes years, and Isabel was beatified, but her canonization process was halted by Pope John Paul II during the 1990s and has yet to be completed. The chronicles written by Isabel's court historians were constructed with a view to heightening the people's sense of her as a just and devoted servant of God and a Catholic crusader. Isabel understood that public opinion was a cornerstone of the power structure she had built, and in order to maintain it, she had to purposefully shape the way that her own people viewed her, as well as how history would remember her. Unfortunately, these efforts were a bit too effective, and the highly biased historical accounts which have come down to us from Isabel's court historians have helped to largely obscure our view of the woman behind the queen, despite the fact that she was one of the most significant women in the history of the Western world. Most traditional historiography prior to the 20th century has treated Isabel of Castile rather romantically as the famously pious warrior queen. As historians have continued to explore and expand upon the impact of her life and reign over the last century, the long-term fallout from her policies have come to be seen as some of history's most terrible injustices. As a result of Isabel's zeal and pursuit of a fully Catholic Spain, reclaimed from 700 years of Islamic rule and religious plurality, she would institute the Inquisition and expel from Spain all Jews and Muslims who refused conversion. In pursuit of the goals of economic expansion and continued Christian conversion, Isabel launched the beginning of a centuries-long process of conquest, which ultimately led to the dispossession and subjugation of indigenous nations across the Americas. The monarchies of Portugal and Spain, both of which Isabel descended from, instituted the first infrastructure and trading relationships with North and West Africa, arrangements which would eventually evolve into the European colonization of Africa and the enslavement of approximately 15 million Africans over the next 4 centuries. Because the effects of policies instituted during Isabel's reign are still being felt today, this makes the detailed study of her reign an important academic and social pursuit. The history of elites and power brokers like kings, queens, and aristocrats is often criticized for vesting entirely too much influence or importance in the role of elites and ignoring the often grassroots nature of movements, ideas, and change. This is true to a certain extent, yet partly owing to Isabel's expansionism and evangelism, there are nearly 2.5 billion Christians in the world today, roughly half of whom are Catholic, and Spanish is the native language of 500 million people, second in numbers only to Mandarin. Yet, despite her undeniable significance, what do we really know about her for sure? She was strong, intelligent, cautious, yet brave, deeply pious, yet also pragmatic. She was a consummate politician, a legendary strategist, and a larger-than-life inspiration to her troops and her people. Beyond these admittedly vague attributions, we know very little, as Isabel's skill at molding public opinion was as legendary as she herself ultimately proved to be. Interestingly, however, there is far less academic literature written about Isabel in English than about Christopher Columbus, whose explorations she financed and the fruits of which she promptly claimed for herself. Perhaps another reason why she has remained a shadowy figure, and even something of a footnote, in elite histories of the English-speaking Atlantic world, was because she was a great woman, rather than a great man. Recent scholarship in women's history has emphasized a previously overlooked and surprising fact about late 15th century and 16th century Europe. It was an age of queens. On the surface, only Isabel I of Castile and Elizabeth I of England seemed to stand out, since there were only a few other queens regnant during the period, and most of them faced political opposition to their rule or questions about their legitimacy. A look beneath the surface reveals a much broader European trend towards female leaders, of whom Isabel was among the very first. Anne de Beaujeu was regent of France from 1483 to 1491. Louise of Savoy acted as regent for her son Francis I of France 3 times between 1515 and 1529. Margaret of Austria, Mary of Hungary, and Margaret of Parma all served as regents in the Netherlands for Charles V of Spain, the Holy Roman Emperor, or for his son Philip II of Spain. The advent of the 16th century saw more and more female authority figures appear. Catherine de' Medici, Caterina Sforza, Mary Queen of Scots, Jeanne d'Albret of Navarre, Christina of Denmark, Henry I of England and her sister Elizabeth I. What is even more interesting than this seemingly sudden profusion of female leadership across Europe during the late medieval period is the frequently strong bond of fellowship between these ruling women, despite often being on opposite sides of contentious international conflict. Motherly and sisterly affection was forged early on among many of these women. Margaret of Austria was raised and mentored by both Anne de Beaujeu and Isabella of Castile, having been betrothed or married to royal princes in both France and Spain. Margaret herself was a mentor to Anne Boleyn, as was Jeanne d'Albret. Mary, Queen of Scots, who was raised primarily at the French court, learned a great deal from Catherine de' Medici. Catherine of Aragon, daughter of Isabel and former sister-in-law to Margaret of Austria, maintained a concerned and loving secret correspondence with another sister-in-law of hers, Margaret Tudor, Queen and Regent of Scotland, despite the fact they stood on opposite sides of a savage war with England. Similarly, Louise of Savoy and Margaret of Austria, who grew up together at the French court, famously negotiated the Ladies' Peace of Cambrai between Austria and France on behalf of the respected princes for which they served as regents. Ladies, they reflected, can easily come to the table with one another without sacrificing their honor, unlike princes and kings. The long-standing relationships of European royal women connected by blood and marriage often made diplomacy a smoother process. Following the death of Elizabeth I, the age of queens appeared to have ended. Numerous European male scholars and writers on politics and law had begun to write vehemently against female leadership during the 16th century, a century in which the continent had been virtually ripped apart by religious wars. Most women rulers who confronted these problems in their countries attempted to stem the tide of instability and violence by demonstrating and encouraging tolerance for religious freedom. The widespread failure of this tactic reinforced the claims of those who opposed female monarchy on general principle. Isabel was among the few exceptions to this rule, and her enormous zeal for Catholicism does much to explain why Protestantism made few inroads in Spain during the century after her death, and was thus spared much of the Christian division that shook the rest of the continent. After the death of Elizabeth I, Europe saw only 4 queens regnant over the next 3.5 centuries: Queen Anne of England, Maria Theresa of Austria, Catherine the Great of Russia, and Queen Victoria of Great Britain. Not until the mid-20th century would female authority figures begin to proliferate once again and begin to exercise power to a degree approaching that of the late 15th and 16th centuries. Isabel of Castile is, without a doubt, one of the most important and consequential women in the whole of human history. Without her, it is, perhaps, doubtful that peaceful union between Castile and Aragon would have happened when it did. The bedrock of this union was Isabel's determination to solidify her rule through a strong marriage alliance with Fernando II of Aragon, and, in achieving this, she successfully ensured that no kingdom in the Iberian Peninsula could challenge the combined might of the 2 unified kingdoms, which, under the reigns of her descendants, would be reborn as the Kingdom of Spain. There are, arguably, as with most historical figures, darker sides to her legacy, namely the instigation of the Spanish Inquisition, the purging of non-Catholics from her realm, and the unforeseen consequences of Spanish rule in the New World, the exploration of which Isabella and Fernando played a pivotal role in instigating. The Spanish colonization and conquest of the Americas would see entire civilizations virtually destroyed through both warfare and disease. However, many of these events could not have been foreseen by Isabel. And if we are to judge her life from a morally neutral point of view, she is a queen whose reign is virtually without parallel in terms of its impact on human civilization, and it could be argued that she should be remembered as perhaps Europe's first great queen. What do you think about Isabella of Castile? Should she be remembered as one of history's greatest queens and women? Please let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching. Thank you for watching People Profiles Documentaries. Please subscribe if you haven't already. And don't forget to hit the bell icon to get notifications so you never miss an upload. If you would like to watch our videos with no adverts of any kind, listen to audio podcast versions of our videos, discuss history with other People Profiles fans, and much, much more, go to peopleprofiles.com and become a member for as little as $2 per month. Members can also receive discounted merchandise, behind-the-scenes material, and a credit in our videos, along with much more. So, please support us in our work in return for exclusive offers at peopleprofiles.com via the link in the video description. Thank you very much for watching.